I'd now like to introduce our next session on climate change and invite Craig Pocock and Martin O'Day to come up to the stage. How the session's going to work is that we'll have the presentations from Craig and then Martin, and then we'll open the floor for question and answers. And as they're making their way up, I'll just provide a bit of an introduction. Martin O'Day is Principal Landscape Architect for Closton Associates in their Sydney office. Martin believes in the value of good design and champions how we as landscape architects should now embrace climate positive design. He was one of the lead authors for the International Federation of Landscape Architects Climate Action Commitment that was presented at the COP26 in November last year. He is the current chair of the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects Climate Positive Design Working Group, and in this role he was the lead author for AILA's Climate Positive Design Action Plan for Australian landscape architects. Now you all know Craig Pocock. He's Principal Landscape Architect at Becker. In 2005 he coined the term the carbon landscape to describe the carbon layer and climate mitigation issues within landscape architecture. This was a challenging concept and the validity of the idea was questioned both nationally and internationally. Craig went on to explore these issues, spending the next 18 years researching, writing, teaching and presenting this important climate change and carbon kaupapa, including conferences in Kuala Lumpur, Rio, Melbourne, Austin, Montreal, and most recently as the opening keynote at the IFLA World Congress in South Korea. The carbon landscape is now a widely accepted and internationally influential idea that whakapopas to New Zealand design DNA. This is the first time presenting the carbon landscape on a New Zealand stage, so please welcome Craig.
Tēnā koutou katoa. So let's talk about carbon. We've got 25 minutes, and my good friend here, Martin's got 25 minutes, so we're going to do it reasonably quickly so we can have 10 minutes of question time at the end of this process. So I'm going to basically talk in the next 25 minutes about predominantly three things. I want to talk about the whakapapa of the carbon landscape, where it come from, why it's important, how it happened. I want to talk to you about the scale of the issue so that you can visualise whether it really is an issue, how big the issue is, whether we should even address it. And then finally, I want to share with you the last 10 slides, which were the last 10 slides I presented at IFLA on how to decarbonise the industry. All right, so let's get into it. So the carbon landscape really come from a comment I made on a stage not dissimilar to this in 2006, where during a award ceremony I mentioned that possibly there was a carbon impact of what we do and we should consider it. It wasn't potentially, I didn't think potentially an interesting statement necessarily, but anyway, I made the statement, and by the end of the week we had a whole series of letters being sent to the NZILA, and the general gist of it was this, that as landscape architects there can't possibly be a carbon impact to what we do, and even if there was, all the trees and all the planting and all the good stuff that we do, the wetlands, all that stuff would surely offset it. And it's like, all right, well, that's a good question. And I can understand why it was such a challenging idea because, we're cool. Like, landscape architects are by far the coolest of all the designers. We're busy, making great places, looking after our communities, acknowledging our tangata whenua, bringing them into our design processes. We are enhancing and protecting landscapes. Like, we are the coolest kids on the block, certainly compared to those architects and civil engineers. So the idea that someone flies back into the country and says, well, actually that's cool, and I fully agree, and it doesn't nullify any of those cool things we do, but there's actually a carbon layer in there that we should really think about and consider. Maybe we should, consider it. And to consider it, we'd have to consider the embodied energy or the carbon impact of what we do. So I just wonder how it stacks up. So I've learned over the years that if you're going to tackle a difficult situation, you normally use yourself as the example. And so I sat down with a Lincoln student and spent about a week going through all my projects and did a very rough carbon calculation of what my carbon footprint might be. And then so we wrote that down. That was pretty straightforward. I'm old enough to have a whole lot of old paper plans, so we measured stuff up. And then we took off the sequestering value, all right, so the carbon consuming value of all those trees, and ended up with a number. Now, honestly, when we first started, I thought it would be like, maybe a little bit, maybe neutral, but a little bit. But it turned out that I had a carbon footprint of 1,100 tonnes of carbon for every year of my career. Right, so I'm looking at you guys thinking every one of you is probably not dissimilar. And as I often say, I had a pretty average career, so I hadn't done anything particularly large or big urban stuff or any of that sort of carry. So I thought that was really interesting. It was unexpected for me. I didn't realise it was actually that big of an issue, so I went to Kuala Lumpur. We got a bit of money together, shot off to Kuala Lumpur, and presented a little session paper at the NZILA World Congress. So I presented the paper, dead silence. The most uncomfortable 20 minutes of my professional career. And there was the only person that asked the question in the audience was Neil Challenger, which if you know Neil, that makes sense. And then that was it, and I remember getting off the stage feeling pretty disappointed. Felt that I'd flown halfway around the world with an idea that was not valid. Soon after that, I got a tap on the shoulder and asked to present the paper a second time at the same World Congress. And I talked to Di Menzies afterwards, and she said that's probably in the history of IFLA the only time a paper has ever been delivered twice at the same Congress. And it was such an unusual idea that was presented from New Zealand DNA that went onto an international stage that challenged everyone. And so by the time I got back from Kuala Lumpur, I had more letters of complaint. And actually it was from a much wider industry, including the American Society of Landscape Architects. So at that point I'm like, all right, cool, I'm onto something. Let's do it. It got published internationally, in multiple languages. 2007, this idea hit the international stage. So then let's talk about where carbon sits. So there's no point being the dude that sort of says, oh, you've got a problem, but doesn't offer solutions. So what I did is I broke down where carbon sits in 4 stages in what we do. So I looked at the carbon impact of how we run an office. It's irrelevant. Right, great, change the light bulbs, get an EV, fine. But that's not where it sits. Where it sits is how we build and how we specify materials, okay? So that's the biggest chunk of carbon that we're responsible for, but not the only one. And I'll go through that bit in detail in a minute. If you understand that there's a significant amount of carbon in the urban spaces that we build, and that you can't design carbon neutral or zero that out, and there is a cost to it, then the absolute worst outcome for the climate and for the next generation is urban renewal, where we replace our urban spaces every 20, 30 years. Even our award-winning spaces, we've replaced in less than 2 decades in some cases. So that's the absolute worst outcome, because fundamentally, by the time we start to replace that space again, we haven't paid off the carbon debt from the first time we built it, and now you're adding more carbon into it. And so what you get is compounding carbon debt or interest, and it's the absolute worst outcome. Finally, the 4th area that we started looking at where the carbon sits is how we maintain our landscape, and I think this is really fascinating, and this is something I've really only started looking at in the last 3 years. Is that we manage all our landscapes with fossil fuels, one way or another. And I'm not just talking about how we mow lawns. Pretty much every aspect of how we manage entire landscape systems and networks across systems is all fossil fuel built. And the per square metre cost of it is nowhere near as big as the implementation cost of building landscape. But it is the carbon debt that just keeps giving and giving and giving the whole life expectancy of that project. So if you can dial that down, it has a profound effect across decades. The other thing that's really interesting about it is we have one of the highest carbon consuming maintenance or management techniques that we could have ever adopted. And what's interesting is it's a throwback from the 18th century. I started looking at why do we do things the way we do it, and actually it's a throwback from colonisation and adopting a Western landscape standard, which was a show of power. So when the original colonials came through and they wanted to replicate what they left at home and to show that they had succeeded, they brought with them, unbeknownst to them I'm sure, a high carbon costing landscape. So what I want to focus on with you is to talk to you about the scale of the issue. Okay, and so what we're going to focus here is really around building and materials and how that works. Fundamentally, the construction industry is the second most polluting industry in the whole world and the heaviest carbon, secondary only to agriculture. And why that's relevant to us is that we're the ones with the pen that draws carbon on that paper. Every sketch, whether it be on tracing paper or in AutoCAD, has a carbon value to every decision you possibly make. So how do we understand that? So about 2 years ago, I sort of pick up different subjects that I want to just sort of look into. And generally, I become interested in green infrastructure. And I wanted to understand the carbon footprint of rain gardens. And so we started doing a little bit of work around that, calculating that out. And the difficulty with rain gardens is when you look at them, they're cool, they're green. You can see community values and ecological values and aesthetics. I mean, they're a beautiful piece of infrastructure that does a lot of work. But to understand the carbon impact of them, you've got to look below the ground. If you're going to understand carbon at all, you can't start and stop at the top surface. And so the way we went about it is we found 6 rain gardens throughout all of New Zealand. And we decided that we'd just pick 100 square metre area, which is a 10 by 10 area, which is, not too different from the size of this stage. And just wanted to work out the carbon footprint of 100 square metres so we could extrapolate it out. The way you do it is we created a model of that 100 square metres. We then exploded each layer out, and we added a carbon number to each one of those layers. These numbers are LCA, so life cycle assessment numbers provided by brands that are New Zealand verified numbers and equated out in an international standard. None of this is mine. This is just me applying it to one thing, but these are all verifiable numbers. So that's how we went about doing it. And so now to demonstrate the sense of scale of carbon mitigation, we had to start somewhere. So we started with a baseline. So this is how, because I'm almost 3 decades into this career, this is how we used to build things in the 90s. The good old AP40, some unit pavers, concrete channel, a slab, way before any sort of rain garden ideas. So we did this as a baseline, and you can see all the components, calculated out there. So 100 square metres of the business as usual is 2.5 tonnes of carbon. This rain garden is in Christchurch. It's got, the really, good functional asphalt surface on either side, nice little bit of concrete edging, really nice planting that helps offset the material, or the cheaper materials. Came in at a carbon cost of 0.8, so significantly below the business as usual, the baseline, which means that you can build green infrastructure for less than the 1960s approach to civil engineering, which is good. Hold on to that idea. The next step up is, I like to call it the minimalist. So we've moved away from the frugal to the minimalist, which means that we just put a little bit more money into the paving. It's got a timber edge. Again, this one's in Christchurch. Had a baseline of 1.2 tonnes per 100 square metre. Now, there's another 3 that I've skipped over here. So I'm just going to the last one. This is what I like to call the carbon deluxe. Right, the carbon deluxe is like a good burger. It's made up of 80mm cut stone epoxy resin onto about half a metre of concrete that's reinforced with steel. It has steel edging with an entire secondary drainage system built into the garden, lined with a nice geotextile and a bunch of material, looking at 16.4 tonnes of carbon per 100 square metres. So I was presenting this at a water conference because I like picking fights. So I didn't worry about you guys. I went straight to the civil engineers and said, look, and the thing with engineers is they get numbers, but they can't necessarily see the outcomes. So what I did is I thought I'd demonstrate it in a different way for them. And so what I did is we grabbed an area that most people would recognise, and we drew that little red square. And this is drawn to scale. The little red square is 100 square metres to scale at the Wynyard Quarter. The yellow square represents the planting offset that you would have to plant to offset the red square. Okay, now when we're talking about planting offsets and thinking back to that old comment about, well, whatever we plant offsets what we do, right? To make this work, we use forestry standard density planting, 300 trees a hectare, the same way as you do a pine plantation. So think about your parks and your 5 trees. We didn't do that. We did a very high density planting. So what does it look like? So here's the minimalist. So sorry, it's not the minimalist, it's the frugal. So the frugal, cheap and happy and highly effective, 89 trees to offset 100 square metres. Right, you've got the minimalist, looking at 130 trees and about half a hectare of land to offset 100 square metres. You get the business as usual. Now we're saying to jump up a little bit, right? So 277 trees and almost a hectare of land to offset 100 square metres. Then the carbon deluxe, 1,783 trees and almost 6 hectares of land to offset 100 square metres. So I sort of thought about that and I was looking at the second stage of the Wynyard Quarter, and it looks like this incredible project, of which it is, and it's an incredible team and an amazing process that we've just seen for the last 3 years that's been rolled out. And I know that they wouldn't do what they did in, those numbers from the Wynyard Quarter is 10, 12 years old, so I'm assuming there wouldn't be that approach to detailing again. But if we applied that 16.4 tonnes per 100 square metres to stage 2, what does that look like? Well, depending on which detail you take, if you do, hang on, we haven't got to the punchline yet. So if you do the business as usual, which is the 1960s approach, which again you guys would never do, you're looking at about 400,000 trees, which is about the size of downtown Auckland if you were to plant it out. If you take the details from stage 1 Wynyard and apply it, you're looking at about 2.6 million trees to offset stage 2. And the point is that you're not going to offset. You can't offset. The challenge is to reduce as much as you can, not offset. You can't do it, it's impossible. It frustrates me when people talk about them offsetting. It's not possible. You need about 8,700 hectares of land. And this is not about the Wynyard Quarter. The truth is somewhere in between. You'll use a range of details, you'll do it in the most carbon sensitive way possible to get the best outcome. So neither of those two, will be the reality of what the final outcome is. I think what the Wynyard Quarter is really exciting about is at $350 million. If that approach, that value of funding is directed towards low carbon approaches, you could create a whole market of low carbon products that currently aren't supported by a whole lot of very small projects. So and you'll hear me talk about it soon, is one of the most powerful things we have for change is our free market value. And that's a hell of a lot of free market value that you could apply to move us forward as a collective a decade ahead of anyone else. It's not about the Wynyard Quarter. I see the same design details. Slabs of concrete, reinforced steel edges, duplication of stormwater systems being rolled out right across the country. This is not about the Wynyard Quarter or that team. I'm just trying to show you the scale of the issue. Those numbers that I've shown you are conservatively low. What I haven't done, and maybe one of my next jobs to do, is to look at the carbon cost of how we actually implement. So all I've shown you is the surface, the cost of the surface. We haven't talked about the actual construction process of how you get there. And we haven't talked about how fat our carbon furniture has got. We're now starting to talk about 2-ton benches. I had a contractor laughing at me the other day saying, I don't know why you're doing bolting details. Once these sit on paving, they can never be moved, even if you wanted to. The point is, in 2022, we need to start thinking about carbon as a baseline so we can make informed design decisions to move forward. It's okay, the numbers sit there, Brands has the numbers, the calculations aren't that hard. All right, so 7 minutes. I'm going to push and talk to you about what I think the 10 steps to decarbonise our industry are. These are 10 steps that I've been thinking about for 18 years, because for 18 years I feel like I haven't made a lot of traction, either with you guys or internationally. And so I've been really, really thinking about, well, how do I get the design industry to change its ways? So the first thing, and this may be recognisable for some of you, you've got to acknowledge you've got a problem. Right? There's a few other organisations that ask you to do that as well, but fundamentally we have an addiction issue with carbon. And not only have we an addiction, the carbon collective footprint that we have since 1990 has gone up threefold, if not fivefold. So we're going the wrong direction, fundamentally going the wrong direction. So we have to acknowledge there's an issue, and when you acknowledge there's an issue, then there's action. But no one ever acknowledges there's an issue, then fundamentally there's not a lot of action. We need to work with our academics. Right? The academics are powerhouses at understanding things, doing the research and coming up with outcomes. But we tend to sit in our, and I'm saying collectively, maybe more me, we sit in our professional practice silo, they sit in their silo, but if we join the two together and we say, look, this is our real problem. We want to reduce the one-year quota by 30%, tell us how to do it. Go and show me all the iterations of research to get that outcome. So we do not have tools or the time or the fees as consultants to be able to do that quick enough, but our academics do. But that means we've got to share. We've got to share information with them, we've got to share accolades with them, we've got to share recognition with them, and vice versa. We've got to embed, so this was presenting at an international stage, we've got to embed the concept of carbon mitigation into our education system. Well, we did that in 2015. So one of the reasons why I joined the exec and wrote the education accreditation is so I could slip a bit of carbon in there. So carbon's in there, you're welcome. So that we can just tick off. The power of this is how it's enforced and how it's judged as we do those accreditation processes. I heard conversations about Pocock and the layer approach. Carbon simply needs to be a layer in landscape architecture in the same way as we have a layer around ecology and people and movement and all the other layers. We just need to add that next layer of carbon in there. It's not particularly hard. We need to start talking about cost and returns and offsets, and we need to redefine what best practice looks like to include carbon. We need to slow down the rate of urban renewal. We need to think in an enduring way, in an intergenerational way. We can't look at projects with a 50-year sort of life cycle. We need to spend that carbon cost, which is high and significant, and it needs to be there for centuries, and it can be there for centuries. I am not going to bore you with the examples, but I can give you so many international examples that are dated in the hundreds of years, not the decades. We need to decarbonise, and I think this is actually kind of exciting, listening to Elena talk and some of the other conversations around the cultural landscape and what the future looks like. If we decolonise some of our landscapes approach, we could decarbonise at the same time. And I think that's really kind of interesting. And I've lived in India and the Middle East and most recently Texas, where none of them use this type of landscape. And their landscapes are richer, ecologically better, perform better from a stormwater perspective, win across the board. There's been a lack of critical thinking, in my opinion, on how we manage our large landscape systems in a non-Western way. So as David, I think, talked about it, we're a competitive lot. And so I think in many ways the best way to make us change is to make carbon part of that competitive behaviour. If we empowered our clients with the tools to do RFQs, RFIs, scoping work, specifications that were all low carbon, you would all follow suit. Simply, if I can't convince you, we convince the market and you guys follow. So this is me wondering why I've failed to get you guys to change, and this is me coming up with crazy ideas to get that to happen. But I think that's one way to do it. And in New York, the Economic Development Council, EDC of New York, did that and were doing that 10 years ago. And the reason why I heard carbon in New York is because this is the way they wrote their specifications. All the think tanks, every consultant had its own think tank. And that's when I first heard about carbon. Applied to architecture. This is a little uncomfortable. the collective carbon footprint of us in the room is the majority of that collective carbon footprint is specified and spent by the minority of us. There are many of us in here that don't do urban design or do small projects or do LVAs or a whole lot of other stuff. So in many ways, recognising the fact that actually, if we can identify who the heavy carbon users are and start having a conversation with them about how that changes, that ultimately reduces our collective footprint much quicker. So I don't need to change all of you, just about a quarter of you. This is Little Island, right? The latest project in New York, which has been incredibly controversial because it's so carbon heavy. And it was very much recognised. The good thing about being carbon heavy is you've also got a massive budget. And this is what I was touching on before. If those individuals and those design groups that are having these giant projects also have these budgets where they can make wholesale change across our entire industry, that's a very, very powerful tool. And so we need to use our free market value. We did some research in about 2010. The collective value of the NZILA per capita is about $500,000 per individual in this room. We have a fair amount of free market power. If we buy environmentally low carbon products, the market will respond to provide those for us. So if we started acting like an environmental consumer and be careful how we specify, we could also change the way the market works. Final. We have to use all the tools available to us if we want to make change. And so the idea of using our industry's recognisations and awards as a way of signalling that we expect a change within our collective, this is a powerful way to do it. I mean, egos, including myself and me standing on the stage, were driven by ego. To be a designer and survive in this world, you've got to have an ego. And our best designers have egos and have been on those international stages. To reach out and use that as a way of influencing change is very powerful. So I had a slightly different approach for and this is the final slide, slightly different take, but to the airflow conversation. But fundamentally, I've been here talking about this for about 18 years. It's video, there's articles, there's evidence, there is a whole ton of information out there. We've kind of got to start. It's 2022. I think the clock's way beyond it. What I would say about this thinking is it's still further ahead than what I saw in Gwangju 4 weeks ago. So talking to the Americans and the Australians and the Scandinavians and the Africans and all the different leadership, the concepts we're talking about here is still further ahead than where they're currently at in the way of understanding how you tone everything down. So I think there's a really great opportunity. And I just think I'll leave with the idea that we've got to start thinking intergenerationally, because to not think as an intergenerational is intergenerational theft. It's not our generation that's going to pay for the decisions that line on the paper. It's not our generation that's going to pay for that, it's the next. And so we've got to reframe the way we look at landscape architecture. All right, thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Martino Day, toko ingoa. So I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners from where I currently reside. That's the Cadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the audience today. I have the privilege of coming from a land that's home to the oldest continuous culture on Earth. That culture dates back at least 65,000 years and potentially longer if you consider the potential land bridges from the last two ice ages. You will perhaps better know my home as Sydney. I live in Lilyfield, which is located only 8 kilometres from the site of the first encounters 234 years ago between the European colonists and the Cadigal people. I acknowledge their continued caring for country, seas and skies, and note that sovereignty was never ceded. It's wonderful to be back here in Aotearoa, And I've heard some great presentations in the last 2 days, and the waterfront tour was pretty amazing. So there's some really great work being done by NZ Landscape Architects. And I guess we all want to do great design and planning work, but we also need to be addressing climate change. And Sir David Attenborough here has described it as the defining issue of our time. The IPCC's sixth assessment report, which came out last year, paints a damning picture. It makes it unequivocally clear that every tonne of CO2 is overheating the planet. And the wonderful Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, called that report a code red for humanity. So what does the Paris Agreement look for landscape architects? Really means that every project, every park, every streetscape, every playground has got to be carbon neutral by 2050. For the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects, we're taking a stronger approach and wanting that to be by 2040, and we've used the Climate Council's assessment of 74%, we've rounded out to 75%, to have a 75% reduction in emissions from landscape projects by 2030, which is a substantial challenge. So this is my funky concrete walls. This is Queen Elizabeth Park in Queanbeyan in New South Wales. And it's a great project, it's reconnected people back to the waterfront, it's platypus friendly, it's accessible to wheelchairs, it's won a raft of awards, got Park of the Year. But in those seat walls alone, and there's a lot more concrete in this park, there's 60,000 plus kilograms of CO2 embedded in 2016. And this little tree here sucked down 19 kilograms last year. So climate positive design is thinking about that intergenerational thing that Craig just mentioned. What's the future we want to leave for our children and our families? And it's really about projects that sequester more greenhouse gases than they emit over their design lives. But they also have a range of multiple co-benefits. So that's social co-benefits, cultural, environmental, and economic co-benefits. So the action plan we've just released last Wednesday is framed around 3 big ideas. So the first one is to understand your climate impacts. The second one is to manage and mitigate those climate impacts. And the third one is then to start the conversation, to collaborate, to communicate, and to advocate. So first of all, how do we actually understand our carbon impacts? The first thing to understand is that the bulk of our emissions really are embedded the day the project's open and the big party's held, and it's fantastic. But yeah, about 75% of our emissions, based on the data we've looked at, is embedded upfront. But the other 25% is those operational emissions that go on beyond that. And that's embedded in all sorts of materials and how we construct and so forth. So we sort of really need to fully consider the whole life cycle of our emissions. Where do they, cradle to grave, and how the whole thing works together. So from the very beginning of vegetation removal, we lose the carbon in those trees plus the foregone sequestration of those trees. Obviously in all the cement and concrete products. Dimension stone you'd think is carbon neutral, but in fact the amount of energy required to cut and transport it in a fossil fuel environment is substantial. Obviously steel, galvanising, aluminium, all of those products are very high carbon intensive products. That is shifting. You'd be surprised how much carbon is in a piece of furniture. Kiln dried timber is way up there in terms of carbon. And then we've got our operational emissions, so that's things like your mowing, your leaf blowing, fertilising, and so forth. So like a leaf blowing using a leaf blower for an hour is about the same as driving from the top of the North Island to the bottom of the South Island in terms of pollution. And then there's the thing that Craig's talked about, this idea of longevity, and potentially also that one comes into laziness in terms of not actually thinking and re-updating stuff. But we do tend to shift things, replace them sooner than we probably should. So in terms of measuring your project's greenhouse gas footprint, the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects has been promoting the Climate Positive Pathfinder, which is a tool developed by Pamela Conrad in California. And while not perfect, it's a really great start. It's free, it's online, you can make your own account. In fact, we suggest people to make two so they can have an account to sort of make components and the other one that gets logged. You can actually tick not built projects so it doesn't contaminate the data. She gets worldwide data that we see as well. But like all cost accounting, like all cost planning, you should measure everything. It's like when you get your credit card bill at the end of the month, you go, how's it $4,000 when there's only lots of $10 purchases? It just adds up. So put in stuff, work it out. If you have to guess, even guess, just so you've got a better account. And then you need to be a bit careful about planting. The way that Pathfinder calculates planting, shrub planting in particular, is that it assumes that the plants are maintained for 50 years, and that's not necessarily the case. They might get not maintained at all, or they might be, even say a domestic house, it might get changed by the next owner, those sort of things. And then lastly, you can use that as a common benchmark. You can get like a metre squared per emissions per metre squared. So you can compare different projects from different parts of your organisation to a benchmark and start to set targets. So the second big thing really is how to manage and mitigate that climate impact. And broadly, climate is talked about in two big ideas. So one is mitigation. So that's stopping greenhouse gases that are cooking the planet from actually getting into the atmosphere in the first place. And the second one is pulling down CO2. That's the only gas we can actually remove from the atmosphere. So that's the mitigation side. So that's where you've got to think about materials. I'll come to that in a minute. And then the other one is the adaptation side. So the adaptation side is the things that Emily was talking about earlier about the flooding, that increased sort of intensity of rainfall, extended droughts, and so forth. So the first thing we could do is to make good strategic decisions. If we can embed climate positive design at the very top level of how we start to think about things, how we write briefs, how do we design projects, and if we can sort of use that for potentially driving policy change, if we can change policy, we don't have to rely on the goodwill of our developers or clients to actually do things, they're just required to do it. So driving policy could make a huge difference. We can make good decisions like making compact cities, make it easy to get around on a bike, make it easier to get public transport, so we're sort of reducing energy elsewhere, reducing the use of fossil fuels. And then simple decisions like, so now in Australia there's still a lot of fossil gas. We just have to say no, this development residential estate is going to have no fossil gas, it's going to have no tanks, everything's going to be electrified. And then we have to start thinking about drawing down CO2. So part of that is, in Australia it's about cultural burning, which while that emits CO2, it's also making a more resilient landscape that is less prone to catastrophic failure. For most of us, the bulk of the carbon that we store in our projects will be in the woody material in our trees. Some of it will be definitely in the soil and also then in the sort of carbon-rich coastal landscapes. If we start to design better, that also is an important component. So that's looking at providing as many trees as possible to maximise the soil plate, maximise water, get those trees to get as big as they possibly can, use less concrete, maximise green space, soft spaces and so forth. And biodiversity is a critical element to that, and biodiverse landscapes sequester more CO2 than just normal monocultures, and obviously designing for longevity. We need to maximise photosynthetic cover, so CO2 gets pulled out of the atmosphere through the little leaf stomata on the trees and on the grasses, so you've got to have the most leaves as possible, you've got to have the biggest branches as possible, you have the biggest surface area as possible of green, and so you've got to find ways to make sure that your trees are going to grow through good soil, through good water and so forth. And then at a bigger scale, at a farming scale, it's like how do we shift to a regenerative farming practice where, say for example in Australia, 351 million hectares is covered by agricultural land, half of Australia's landmass. So more resilient, high carbon soils are more resilient to rainfall, they absorb more water, and it's an approach where you're looking at the you're designing for the soil, not the stock of the crop. So as a landscape architect, it's the same thing. We want to make sure the foundation is really, really strong. And then the sort of thing you could do tomorrow back in the office is to start changing your specifications, looking what you've currently got sitting there. In Australia, the business as usual would be just N for normal concrete, N25. We should all be specifying S, special concrete, so that it's got some sort of admixtures. There's people here in New Zealand that clearly make that stuff. So you should also probably go, okay, we want N25 concrete that's less than 220 kilograms of CO2 per cubic metre as part of the requirement. You could even rethink the queuing time. We're not holding up a building, so that means we could use less. We could turn to probiotic fertilisers, which don't emit nitrous oxide. And we could start to talk to the councils, we could start to talk to our landscape contractors about shifting to an all-electric approach, which has multiple co-benefits for the users, from hearing loss through to smelling like diesel. In 2018 and 2019, Penrith in Sydney was the hottest place on the planet at 48.6 degrees or thereabouts, so almost 50 degrees. So in Australia, we are needing to start thinking about planning for the 50-degree city. The heat scientist Dr. Sebastian Fausch has measured an unofficial world record in Aids in Sydney's west at 50.5 degrees. So thinking about one of the simplest things, which we all do, it's all part of our toolkit. So this is all about adaptation. These parts are adaptation. So to a lot of us, they're carbon, they're landscape architecture 101. And we put these in the guides because we know that you can also show them to clients, and you can also, there's lots of junior staff members who say, oh, I'd love to know a bit more about that. So we all know that sort of like trees can reduce pavement temperatures by 30 degrees. They can go from 60 degrees to 30 degrees. And so maximising our tree cover, maximising the growth, using passive irrigation to water them, and that idea of the blue-green grid extending the connectivity. And also then how do we protect our old trees, our old street trees? When we have droughts in Australia, they have water restrictions, and they sort of cut the water and down and down and down to a point where we've got 100-year-old trees that aren't being watered. And if they die from a 3-week heat wave, we've lost the 100-year asset. So we've got to think about how do we protect those assets? How do we make sure they can still be watered even though there's water restrictions going? How do we design water-resilient cities? And there's a really interesting study done about 15 years ago in China that showed that for every dollar they spent to mitigate things with dikes and dams, it actually flooded more. So it just kept going up, the dollars kept going up, and the flooding kept going up. And the next keynote speaker is really going to be very exciting to hear about that whole idea of sponge cities. We need to be sort of saving gigalitres of water from stormwater, capturing that, reusing it, so we can reduce our potable water supplies. We need to be recycling gigalitres of sewerage water as well. I mean, we have this very strange linear system where we catch water in a distant catchment, we treat it to totally drinkable standard, and we pipe it, and then we drink about 10% of it, and all the rest of it gets flushed down the toilet and out into the ocean. Then we've lost that resource. So we need to be heading to a circular system that retains and keeps all that water, because we are going to get drought stress and we're going to have lots of trouble. At the end of the 2019 drought that led to those terrible fires, Sydney's Warragamba Dam had less than 730 days of water left. We're also going to be needing to design for locked-in sea level rise. We have committed to future generations a substantial rise in sea level. At the moment, that's measured in centimetres, but it won't be that long before it starts to be measured in metres. So in the next 50 years, maybe 100 years, but certainly in the next 50 years, we're going to start to have adaptation to that rising sea level before we potentially then start to have the difficult conversation about managed retreat. And so that might be things like, instead of having a full levee, you have a levee that's got doors so you can actually walk to the water and still see the water. It's not walled off. But eventually that won't be enough. We could also use environmental solutions like mangroves and other sort of ecological approaches. So the scale idea is pretty critical as well. And how do we apply that at a whole range of scales? Most of us in the room here largely work in that top row, from the residential house estate through to commercial shopping centres and urban cores, waterfront edges to campuses and universities, and accessible cycle-friendly cities. So that's where all the usual landscape architecture 101 toolkit comes in terms of our green cities, our cool green grids. But then we get to the next level, which is at the city scale. So, and Gary sort of mentioned some amazing stuff being done around a big catchment scale. So that's the sort of scale we need to start to be thinking at. How do we connect up all those catchments? How do we actually sort of manage all the water? How do we get those green targets? How do we get our canopy targets for those public spaces? I don't know about here in New Zealand, but in Australia, the Great Australian Backyard has gone. It's been shrinking for years, and now it's to the point where there's virtually nothing left. There's not even a place to plant a tree. So all of the, at a city scale, that's putting a huge stress on the public realm for everything, from not just recreation, but for water capture, for tree canopy cover. So we're now having to get, the canopy cover targets in just the public realm alone, let alone in the private realm. Then the next level up is is extending that idea, the blue-green grid idea, out to the farmlands. And so this is where we've got Di driving around in her VW with the laptop in the back and doing little farm plans for people. And we want to convince our farmers to convert 20% of their land to biodiverse outcomes, so riparian corridors and so forth. And we can also, the other thing we've got the ability to do is we've got all the government-owned land, all the state-owned land, so that's all the roads, the train lines, all the linear corridors, and we're going to need to use these linear corridors to create biodiverse corridors for plants to move. By 2070, maybe 2100, Christchurch will have Auckland's climate. So we need to be able to plan for those shifts. And in Australia, we want to have those big, long linear corridors. Here in Aotearoa, probably be more like a green necklace where the birds can move, but the pestet species can't. Then we need to move up to a sort of state level about how do we start to think at a much bigger level, protecting our rivers, protecting our streams. And then at an Australia-wide level, we need to stop our land clearing. We've got a huge land clearing problem. And our issue is also fossil fuels. How do we stop fracking and sending it overseas? So at that sort of scale also, we're talking about 30%. These targets that Richard Well and others were talking about, 30% reduction or protection of lands, 30% protection of oceans. And equally at a planetary scale, we need to be aiming for at least 30% of our natural systems to be protected. So lastly, the idea of collaboration and communication. And the first one of that is obviously engaging with traditional owners. And Alana, made a very passionate approach about how that is, quite a challenging conversation. But it's about listening first, about deep listening, about engaging, about recognising Indigenous people understand their place, and so forth. So I think that's a really important ongoing discussion, and it's something that's also a new and ongoing discussion in Australia. And the Connection to Country conference starts this afternoon, which is really focused largely on that whole idea. How do you collaborate and communicate within your organisation? So find your climate champion, find that person in the office who can run and drive with things. How do you talk to the engineer in the other department to say, yes, you can actually use this concrete? How do we collaborate with allied people like architects, planners? And lastly, Craig made it pretty clear that it's our materials that we use that are driving our carbon footprint. We need to be having that discussion with our manufacturers. Every time you phone them, say, can you provide me with your EPD data sheet? So they go, okay, well, I've got to start doing that. And then lastly, how do we actually get into that policy space? So I'm just going to touch very quickly on, these are the three documents that AILA's just produced. So the first one is largely what I've just been talking about, and that's what you can do as a landscape architect. The second one is about what your office can do to drive carbon neutral chains, to reduce your footprint. We found that 75% of offices' carbon emissions come from four things. So it's electricity, transport, air transport and car hire. And then lastly, we've got a manual for the Institute for how they can drive that change and what they need to do to provide education guides. So these are now online, so if you Google AILA Climate Positive Design, you should get that page and navigate to the document page, and there's links there to be able to download them. We have developed a series of 9 little 3 to 4 minute, 5 minute max videos, like they're little sound bites to be able to understand where things are. So the first 3 of those are up online now. The next 3 will be up very soon, and the final 3 will be up before the end of the year. But they're just other ways that you can talk about it. You can have a lunch and learn in your office and have a 3-minute video and then talk about it. We are trying to find the best of the best resources that we've been using and trying to get them online as well, so that that you don't have to go searching for that. So I think at your 50th anniversary, think about what it's going to be like at the 75th anniversary. The world really needs us, landscape architects, and I think this is our time and our time to shine. So thank you very much. I've realised I've got a few more. Sorry, I will just quickly. So, just in summary, so you can remember, engage with traditional knowledge, design low carbon landscapes, design cool green cities, design water resilient cities, design public transport, walkable friendly cities, and then apply these at scale to Aotearoa. So, thank you.
So we wanted to keep our presentations reasonably short. We knew that we didn't go through complete details and everything, with the hope that you would feed some questions in. There's been a lot of information. Martin's certainly a wealth of knowledge and has been working in this area of climate really tirelessly. Really has carried and shouldered a lot of the weight of the Australian work in this space, which is part of the reason why you guys are really far ahead in that guidance back to their community. So anyway, we would love some questions. There's some mics floating around. I'm not very good at doing this bit, but I'm just going to do it anyway. So question time. You can just pick Martin or me or whatever your question is. All right, let's just start over here. Thank you.
Kia ora. My name is Erin from Pocock, Auckland, and I was a student many years ago, Craig. What a fascinating topic, and it influenced me a lot. So from a personal perspective, I think I've got a couple of questions here. With my Chinese background, I just love talking about figures and numbers. So when we're talking about quantify the carbon footprint of a particular project, just thinking about when I wanted to present these to our future clients, I would like to know what kind of data base that is available in New Zealand context. And I think Martin mentioned that there's a great tool developed by the American landscape architects called Pathfinder, and if you look into that, that was a great tool for us to use as a benchmark. But when you look into the details, like for example, we're talking about calculating the carbon absorption, the carbon emission from different material like concrete, steels, or talking about the planting trees, how do you offset the carbon. It's actually quite different from Australian or the New Zealand context, because obviously we plant different types of trees, and the natives and exotics and pine trees are different. So I'm just wondering, is there any tools available in New Zealand or Australia, and can we actually make something more useful in New Zealand context?
Okay, cool. Do I have to stand up and answer questions, do you think?
Yeah, do you want me to answer?
Oh, you can say, yeah, good.
Okay. Thanks for the question. Actually, I may just sit down. I think this might be easier. Body around. The question was, what are the tools that we've got available, particularly in New Zealand, given that the Pathfinder is an American tool? And So first of all, Pathfinder is a great tool, and it does have lots of pull-down menus for concrete and steel and so forth. They are based on the Athena database in America. The planting is based on growth rates and 3 different types of planting. So you've really only got 9 choices. And to be honest, it's a little bit rubbery anyway. Like if we've gone and measured trees in projects and they've gone from this big to this big from the same trees that were planted exactly at the same time. So there's quite a lot of variation in that. So the fact that that's more of an average, I think, is okay. There's also the Epic database, which I forgot to mention. So then in Melbourne, there's 850 materials in the Epic database, and you can download those. But yes, we need more information on sequestration sides of it. But broadly, we've got to start somewhere. So the Pathfinder is a great tool, even though it's American-based. We've done a explainer, like some of the terminology. We've got a cheat sheet that explains what you should be looking for in Australia. But we've also got them to put in a custom tool, so you can make a custom component and then just use that, and you can use your own data.
So just, Aaron, from a New Zealand perspective, and it's a really interesting question, because when we started this conversation 18 years ago, the carbon data hardly existed at all. There was a Sauron think tank in Canterbury University, a guy called Acorn, had done a spreadsheet of simple numbers. However, jump forward 18 years, Brands has a complete spreadsheet of most numbers, often focused on architecture, but most of the materials that we use, particularly the concretes, the steel, stainless steel, are all sitting on that Brands website, which you can get access to anytime. Unfortunately, we don't have a tool. I use spreadsheets to work it out. However, the numbers are available. Now, why that's important is the minute that you use depends on how spiky the conversation is going to get. But when I've used numbers, and those initial criticisms was, yeah, but you're using American numbers, they don't count. In New Zealand, it's different. And particularly, it's true with concrete. So the way concrete is manufactured and the embodied energy within concrete depends on where they got the power source. The problem with concrete is Portland cement. To make Portland cement, you need a massive amount of energy, and where that energy is used, come from, whether it's gas, heavy crude oil, affects the number. So using New Zealand numbers where possible is really important, and now we have access to most of those. The hardest one to get is cut stone, and we're working on with the suppliers, particularly Horizon's been excellent, Nathan's been excellent in helping us find those numbers, where the ports are and all that sort of carry on. Sequestering, when I looked at that again 18 years ago, there was one research paper, which was a Canadian research paper, that quoted about 9 kgs of carbon a year per tree, averaged over the lifespan of a tree. Now, when I did that last piece of research, there was like 24 papers. There's so much work now. And you are right, it does depend on where the tree is. However, in New Zealand, and I can't tell you exactly where it is, but you should be able to find it, is someone has done a whole bunch of work on sequestering rates of typical New Zealand trees, including New Zealand native forest and pines. So now, actually, we've got a lot of information. You've got to just work a little harder to get it. It's not in a little carbon tool. Maybe we'll have that done in 6 months. We'll just hand it out to you all, and you'll just tap it away and be awesome. But fundamentally, it requires a bit more legwork, but the numbers are available. Now, there was another question over here. Can we...
Thanks. Hello.
It's working.
I just had a question about, I work a lot in the kind of master planning space, and we often have this conversation kind of internally about the kind of conflict about developing brown grey field versus getting a fresh start in a greenfield environment. And you look at the kind of the carbon cost of earthworks, which is massive, right? But then at the same time, there's an opportunity to kind of take these rural, colonial landscapes, if you will, and restore them back to maybe what it was. Maybe it was a peatland formerly or a wetland, and you kind of integrate that back into the landscape, into the master plan. And then at the same time, you have an opportunity to kind of build back better and do well-integrated high-density living with better materials, integrate road shift from the get-go, rather than trying to, tweak the existing, urban kind of constraints. So, I can go on, but the question was, what are your thoughts on that? redevelop brownfield, greyfield that's been done poorly, or take that opportunity to do greenfield right?
I think it's an interesting question because what you're asking for is justification for greenfield growth. So my gut feeling is God isn't making any more land. And the quicker when we cover it and urbanise it and build more infrastructure, the less. And this is not my field of expertise at all, really. Really I predominantly talk about carbon mitigation. But the more land we cover, I think the more, my gut feeling is the more environmental impact. It might be slightly more carbon heavy to develop those brownfields, but if you can get greater density out of those brownfields that are still more central to projects, to jobs, to PT, that feels to me like a better outcome. But it's not my field of expertise. Do you have a take on that?
Oh, look, I think it's a tricky question. I mean, I think the first thing is, do you have to demolish something? If you can recycle something, there's carbon that's there that you don't have to change. And I'd also add that there are some tools. Sasaki from the United States have done an upfront calculator for thinking about big scale things and different land uses and where it would lend you. So it gives you an idea to plan up front. But I would say that we need to design compact cities that don't require a lot of transport, that people can ride their bikes around. Sydney is just getting sprawl, so that it is difficult to do the brownfield stuff, but we do I think, need to think about strategically about how compact things can be and how walkable they are.
I would say now that I've had that 30 seconds to think about it. One of the problems with greenfields that makes it difficult is pulling all the infrastructure out to connect those greenfields back into those cities, whether it be wastewater, often stormwater can be dealt with on site, power generations and all the rest. So it's not just the cost of the development itself, but it's making all those connections. McDonald have created quite an interesting carbon calculator around just underground infrastructure. And I jumped in and got a copy of it and went through some sessions with them. And it's really good. The value, it doesn't help us from a carbon surface perspective. It's not useful for that, really. They've spent like a decade putting this calculator together. It really is around pump stations and pipes. And what they do have is a comparison between traditional stormwater pipes and wetlands, so that you can start looking at the carbon cost of balancing off traditional versus wetland. So McDonald have quite a good infrastructure calculator if you want to sort of look at what your greenfield expansion is looking like. So we're down to 15 seconds. It's like yelling at me.
One more.
Your one more question? All right. I die. I could almost guess what this one might be.
I just wanted to make sure people know that in terms of sequestration, this tool we're developing for the big scale, the land planning tool, will have more than 100 different types of vegetation that you can look at options, explore options in terms of the amount of sequestration. So, hopefully, it's for big scale, it's not for your wee garden design, but it should be useful, I think, for people, because we've got good, all that science you refer to is being used in developing this tool.
Thanks. We need big scale, though. We definitely need big scale. So.
I just wanted to add to what Di just said. First of all, I want to thank you, Craig, for inviting academics and professionals to work, coming from academia, Lincoln University. Our postgrad students do amazing work. And to add to what Di just said, we need to talk more also about carbon sequestration. I have a PhD student who's working on the importance of wetlands and how can we as landscape architects choose the right plants in wetlands so that we can sequester more carbon. So it's great that we talk about the impact of infrastructure and concrete and steel, but also we have to talk more about our saltwater wetlands and our freshwater wetlands and the role that they play. And as landscape architects, we should be designing more wetlands.
It's a great point. I mean, thank you for bringing that up. I use trees because you guys can visualize trees, and certainly engineers can visualize trees. The reason I use trees is it's easy to visualize. However, wetlands and meadows often consume more carbon per square metre than a tree does. So the whole environment is full of a whole lot of different ways where carbon's sequestered. The problem we have is that research happening in a silo over there. We're not very good at accessing it. We're not very good at finding you. We're not very good at sharing with you, and so that slows us all down. And that's the bit that I think, for a couple of decades now, we've been talking about working closer together, and I think that's the solution. All right, now this thing's really yelling at me now. Anyway, I've got to pull the pin now. Handbrake.
It was a pretty interesting discussion. I was keen to let that run for a little while, but I can only get away with so much. Look, thanks again, Martin and Craig. Really thought-provoking and interesting things for us to go and think about. I'm sure there's some of us in the room, myself included, who's had our project images included in your presentation. We're probably all feeling slightly uncomfortable at the moment. But thanks very much, Martin and Craig.